My name is Johanna, and I work with the Department of Toxic Substances Control. I will be your meeting facilitator for this evening. For those of you already signed on into the web meeting link, you should be seeing the instructions on how to participate on your screen right now. For those of you participating by phone, you can view the participant agenda and presentation slides at dtsc.ca.gov/excite. By participating in this meeting, you understand that this meeting is being recorded. You may be muted for background noise. During the question and comments, we will focus on answering questions related to tonight's presentation. We'll do our best to listen and address all comments and questions so that everyone has the opportunity to participate. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Tonight's meeting is convened by the California Environmental Protection Agency's Department of Toxic Substances Control, or DTSC. The mission of DTSC is to protect California's people and the environment from harmful effects of toxic substances by restoring contaminated resources, enforcing hazardous waste laws, reducing hazardous waste generation, and encouraging the manufacture of chemically safer products. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to share updates with the communities affected by the Excite Cleanup Project, invite feedback, and answer questions on the work stoppage and resumption of work at the Excite Technologies facility. Meeting materials are available at www.dtsc.ca.gov/excite. For members of the media, please get in touch with our DTSC Public Information Officer, Barbara Zumwalt, at barbara.zumwalt@dtsc.ca.gov. You should see tonight's agenda on slide 6. Tonight's presentation will cover the work stoppage and resumption of work at the Excite Technologies facility. We will have presentations by Senior Scientist Amanda Cruz with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Region 9, by Roberto Pugo from the Vernon Environmental Response Trust, also referred to as VERT, or the Trust. Those presentations will be followed by a presentation by Renee Bermudez and Victor Yip from the South Coast AQMD. Slide 7, please. To make sure everyone is aware of how to ask questions or make comments when you get to that portion of the meeting, this slide gives you an overview of the 3 ways. First, Zoom audio. To use Zoom audio, use the raise hand feature, and you will be invited to unmute your audio when it's your turn. Phone audio. Press *9 to join the queue to ask questions. The facilitator will say the last 4 digits of your phone. And when it's your turn, press *6 to unmute your line. Text only. To have your question read by the facilitator, please use the Q&A feature. You can also email us at excitecleanup@dtsc.ca.gov, and we will do our best to answer all your questions and comments. Now, I would like to invite DTSC's Deputy Director, Grant Cope, for Site Mitigation and Restoration, to share some opening remarks with us.
Great, thank you very much. Good evening. I want to thank you for taking some time, nearing the end of a really long week, a really full week with the resurgence of COVID. This is an extremely important facility, so I'm really glad that you're taking time this evening to be with us. My name is Grant Cope. As Johanna said, I'm Deputy Director of the Cleanup Program, pardon me. The purpose of the meeting is to provide additional details on monitoring results at the facility and around the facility in the spring, and to go into, basically provide more information to you on the actions that were taken in light of those results. I'll provide just essentially a framework, brief recap, to set the stage, and then I'll hand it off to EPA and VERT. So to recap, in mid-April to about mid-May, emissions at the facility were nearing the 30-day rolling average permit limit for lead at the facility. And seeing this, VERT proactively expedited lab results, and upon reviewing the data, stopped. So once again, they proactively stopped work at the facility. Regulators were keyed into this information as well. So we got together and initiated an investigation to try and locate the source. And DTSC and US EPA agreed that work should not go on until additional controls were in place. The VERT initially provided a list of additional controls. And at that point, an offsite monitor from South Coast showed a registered above the 30-day limit. Since VERT had already stopped work, there was essentially nothing more to do besides take a look at the controls and determine whether, and if so, how work should proceed. In early June, the regulators allowed work to temporarily resume to assess the effectiveness of the controls. We decided to add controls because we were looking at one monitor in particular that was still reading high, and we didn't want to just expect that it would go away. So we basically said we need additional controls. We put those on. In June, we allowed work to resume, and the good news is the lead concentrations have decreased about 20% to where they were reading in mid-May. So I'll hand it back to Johanna. That's just kind of the framework, broadly speaking, and then the VERT and US EPA can go into greater detail. Once again, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Grant, for those opening remarks. Next, I would invite Amanda Cruz from US EPA Region 9 to provide us with her presentation.
Good evening. Thank you for your time tonight to come hear our discussion. I am Amanda Cruz, and I'm the project manager for the United States Environmental Protection Agency's facility work for this project. Next slide, please. I wanted to go over a little bit about what the standards we'll be talking about tonight mean to help understand what we mean when we talk about the different EPA standards and the South Coast AQMD standards. So EPA established a health-based standard, and those standards are based off a 90-day or a 3-month rolling time period. And this was done as a means to get the entire area or the basin that's being measured into an attainment. In order to meet those EPA health-based standards, AQMD prepared a rule, which is called Rule 1420. And that rule, it regulated the permitted facilities to a level of 0.1 over a 30-day period. And so this was done as a way to gain control over the facilities that were permitted to then allow essentially a fugitive emissions to still kind of occur without the ability to control, which would then keep their health-based standard of 0.15, the EPA's health-based standard, to be met. So we can go to the next slide, please. So as Grant did mention, there was a detection at one of the AQMD monitors. So there are on-site monitors that the trust will talk about, Roberta will talk about next. And then AQMD does run their own set of monitors associated with this facility. And one off-site monitor detected the lead levels that were above that Rule 1420 limit. Again, that was based off a 30-day limit. So as you can imagine, a single day of an elevated reading will result in a much greater impact to the results. And AQMD will go over the results and the impacts of their 30-day rolling average at their presentation. It is important to note, however, that EPA's national health-based standard for lead in the ambient air has not been exceeded. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, all the latest updates on our website are posted. We post them on Tuesday unless there's something that happens more urgent or more frequent that we have to post in the meantime. But in general, you can check back on Tuesdays if you're interested in any of our postings. The information on the shutdown, it was posted in real time, so it'll be in our archive section if you would like to see what we were saying at the time. Additionally, the Trust created a very comprehensive document in both English and Spanish on the details that will be explained in this presentation, but in case you wanted to read them again later, they are present on our website. Contact information for both the Trust and for the US EPA is present on the website. And as always, feel free to contact me with any questions you have. I'm always available to answer. Thank you for your time tonight. And up next is Roberto with the Trust.
Thank you, Amanda, for that presentation. And yes, our next presenter will be Roberto Puga from the Vernon Environmental Response Trust.
Thanks everyone for joining this evening. I appreciate your participation. What I'm going to do, I think Mrs. Cruz and Mr. Cope did a good job of summarizing what occurred. I'm going to talk about it in a little bit more detail. I'm going to walk you through, the locations of the site monitoring networks, both ours, the VERTs, and the AQMDs, what the conditions at the site were when this episode occurred, talk about the elevated lead measurements that we had, and then walk you through the VERT's response to these measurements. I'll share the evaluations and the escalating set of dust mitigation measures that we put into place to resolve the issue. I can tell you it was an extraordinarily stressful time for us. As the last thing that we would want to do as we're cleaning up the site is to actually cause a danger to the community. The problem was compounded somewhat because there wasn't a real obvious source to the lead dust. But through our evaluations, we did come to some conclusions about the causation of the issue. And we, as both Mr. Cope and Mrs. Cruz pointed out, we did resolve the problem, and we are now back at work with good perimeter monitoring results. I would like to say, too, before we get into the details, that it was a team effort. Our staff, the VERT staff, our contractor, AIS, and our agency partners, we all worked together to meet the challenge head on and understand what was going on. I got a lot of good feedback and suggestions from all our agency partners. And I think the entire episode, was one that gave us a lot of lessons learned. But also, I think it did show that the controls that are inherent in our permit, did work. We were able to identify this problem before, we came close to exceeding any sort of health-based standard. And we were able to use that data to measure the efficacy of the dust mitigation measures that we did put into place. All right, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is May 2021. This is the condition of the site. Segment 1, which was the receiving building and the lead storage building, was decontaminated and deconstructed by Exide before they went bankrupt. When the trust took over, Segment 2, which was the smelter building, had the FEU, the full enclosure unit, or HACI, built. But by May, we had finished the decontamination and the deconstruction of the smelter building. So in this picture, it's gone. And all you see is the scaffolding or the framework that held up the plastic sheeting that made up the full enclosure unit. But the actual smelter building was gone during this episode. And which was, part of the challenge. You would think that, we would have had a problem when the lead smelter building was there. But the FEU did its job and prevented, dust from that deconstruction from getting out. But the problem we had was when we were dismantling all of this pipe work that makes up the scaffolding and support for the segment two FEU. Next slide, please. And this is a site view from June 2021. Here you can see that the scaffolding is all gone. We did resolve the problem. We started to get good, consistent monitoring results at all of our perimeter monitoring stations, and we were able to finish the dismantlement of the scaffolding that held up the segment 2 FEU, and then we have turned our attention to the last major industrial installation at the site, which is the bag house building. Next slide, please. So this shows the VERT ambient air stations. There's 5 of them. The southeast, southwest at the bottom of the picture, the midpoint at the midpoint of the picture, and then 2 on the northern ends, the northeast and the OSN. The problem that we encountered was in the northeast station, and only that station in the VERT network. The other 4 stations did not show the elevated lead concentrations that we saw in the northeast station. They all stayed in their typical ranges. Next slide, please. This shows the 3 monitors that make up the South Coast AQMD monitors that are part of the permit for the site. And then again, of the 3, only 1 had an issue. It was the one that is closest to the northeast station. It's called RERIG. After the facility that is placed on, it is across the street and maybe 150 feet away from the northeast monitor that the VERT has. So it's not surprising that the results will be very similar. It's important to note that I can access the data from the VERT monitors, within 24 hours, and I use that data to make operational decisions, make sure we're in compliance with the permit, make sure that we're being safe for the community and for our on-site workers. The data from AQMD is data that is used to confirm the data that we collect at the site. I don't have access to it in kind of an immediate sense, but I will say the AQMD was very proactive in identifying an issue with the RERIG monitor. They let me know as soon as they knew that there was a problem there. They let me know as soon as they knew that particular monitor exceeded. I think that shows really good communication. I think they let me know. It was like a Friday night, and they went out of their way to call me and let me know to make sure that I took that into consideration. But as Mr. Cope pointed out, at that point, we already knew that we had an issue, and we had already stopped proactively and voluntarily had stopped the work. Next slide, please. And this is the actual Northeast ambient monitoring station. It's the monitors you see there are automated high volume total suspended particulate samplers. There's 2 units at each location so that we can have continuous 24-hour sampling. So the samplers alternate so that one of them can collect a sample from midnight to midnight on day 1. And then at midnight, that meter shuts off and the second meter turns on and runs midnight to midnight. One of our contractors, Omega, comes out every morning to collect the previous day's 24-hour sample and insert a new filter sample paper in that unit and reset the timers. Next slide, please. All right, so Mrs. Cruz kind of went through this already, but the key standards, the key bars that we have to meet out there, are the rolling 30-day average for lead, As she pointed out, it is 0.1 microgram per meter cubed. If we exceed this limit, we know we have a requirement to notify the AQMD immediately. And also on daily, if the daily concentration exceeds 0.3 micrograms per meter cubed, we need to notify immediately the AQMD. And then, as Mrs. Cruz pointed out, the EPA's health-based standard for lead in ambient air is 0.15 microgram per meter cubed, averaged over 3 months or 90 days. And we did not approach this standard in either the VERT monitoring stations nor in the AQMD's monitoring stations. Next slide, please. So, the chronology of events is that, in kind of early to mid-May, we review the data often. It usually takes maybe 48 hours normally to get the data. So we would have about a 2-day lag, but we did start to note that the data, the elevations in the Northeast monitor, and only the Northeast monitors, were starting to become elevated. And because of this, on May 17th, we decided to stop and reassess what we were doing. And we, on May 20th, we came back and we did a number of things to try to address the dust problem. That included HEPA vacuuming of the sidewalk along 26th Street, which is right in front of where the Northeast monitor is. Vacuuming the roof of the finished lead warehouse building, which was the building immediately adjacent to segment 2 FEU, washing the remaining scaffolding from the FEU for segment 2, and then washing the pavement throughout the north and south yards of the site. On May 21st, we observed another elevated reading in Northeast Station. And on the same day, AQMD notified us that they had a very high lead concentration in their off-site monitoring station on May 13th. So there was a lag in us finding out, but again, because we were already in a responsive mode, we were already doing everything we could when we received the notification from the AQMD. So we suspended again, as has been pointed out. And then in June 7th, we resumed half-day operations in removing the scaffolding. The additional mitigation measures were additional dust suppression by misting and water cannons. And we also accelerated the laboratory analysis to 24-hour turnaround. So we would get the data back much sooner. Next slide, please. And then on June 8th, we paused again. We wanted to make sure that we were getting the correct mitigation measures. As it turned out, we still had an elevated result on June 7th. So again, we voluntarily stopped work while we put together some more enhanced mitigation measures and asked our regulatory partners, for some input on the measures that we were using. Also on June 8th, a notice to comply was issued by the AQMD, which requested documentation, inspection logs, analytical data, and photographs and video taken of the site. And we compiled all that information and submitted it to the AQMD on June 15th, which was the date that they had asked us to get that information to them. On June 10th, we submitted enhanced mitigation measures for the scaffold removal to our agency partners for review and comment. These measures included pressure washing the inside pipes of the vertical legs of the scaffolding, installation of a water mister system around the perimeter of the work zone, use of windscreen, and enhanced water suppression during the scaffold disassembly, and then limiting the scaffold removal work hours. So on June 14th, 16th, and 18th, we went ahead and did half days of scaffold washing and dismantlement. Then we stopped on June 15th and 17th to allow us to be able to look at the data from the previous day. The data indicated that the enhanced measures were effective, and we were getting concentrations that were much more in line with what we had seen previous to this episode. And then by June 21st, the exterior segment 2 scaffolding dismantlement was completed. Next slide, please. So, we did want to go through a causation review. Obviously, we do not want a repeat of this episode ever again, and we were looking for lessons learned. So we looked at, the inspections of the scaffolding and the shrink wrap, the records from that, pictures and videos from our daily drone flights. We have a drone that flies over the FEUs looking for holes and tears in the plastic so that we can repair that. We looked at the ambient lead concentrations, obviously, our daily and 30-day averages, and we looked at the weather station data. So wind direction, average wind speed, and max 1 minute wind gusts. Next slide, please. So in terms of the scaffolding and shrink wrap, there was a small tear or more of a seam separation in the plastic that we saw via drone video on May 13th. That was one of the days we had an elevated lead concentration. We notified the agencies on May 14th via email. And, we went through all of the other sheets, inspection sheets, we saw from May 18th through June 3rd, there was small holes or minor damage to the shrink wrap. This is not unusual. It is plastic shrink wrap. It is susceptible to small tears or minor damage. All of this is repaired, as soon as it's found. But it's important to note that, within the segment 3 building, none of the negative air pressure was ever lost. So segment 3, is under negative air pressure so that, air gets sucked in rather than being allowed to escape. And at no time, even on the days that we saw holes or minor damage, the negative air pressure was maintained within segment 3. Next slide, please. The ambient lead concentration. So in terms of daily, on May 13th, we got a 0.289. The highest concentration we saw was observed on May 21st. That was 0.495 micrograms per meter cubed. Per our permit, there was a condition that required a formal notification to HMD, and that was done. And then after May 21st, concentrations decreased significantly and are now in our typical range. And as we said earlier, for the daily, if it's above 0.3, we're required to notify formally. And we only had one of those instances at the Northeast station. In terms of 30-day average, the average concentration on May 13th was 0.087, so still below the permit standard. And then the highest 30-day average concentration that we measured at the Northeast station was on May 22nd, and it was 0.097, very high, but not exceeding the permit limit. And then similar to the dailies, the 30-day average started to decrease significantly after May 25th. And then again, it's just a reminder, the permit limit is 0.1 microgram per meter cubed, and the national ambient air quality standard for lead, as Mrs. Cruz pointed out, is 0.15 micrograms per meter cubed. Next slide, please. And here you can see all of the 5 perimeter monitoring stations data for lead, starting from when the VERT took over the site. You can see that 4 of the stations have stayed pretty steady along the traditional ranges, far below the permit limit. And then you see the gray line, which is the Northeast station, and you see how we approached our permit limit but never exceeded it. And then now we're back down to traditional limits, less than 0.02 microgram per meter cubed. Next slide, please. And then arsenic, we never saw an arsenic issue, even in the Northeast station. Our issues were solely with lead. Arsenic never really wavered from the traditional averages. Next slide, please. Weather station data. So the average wind direction from May 13th through June 3rd was from the east-southeast. That is typical at the site. That's typically what we see, with the wind increasing in the afternoon. Really, the only time it deviates from this is if we get a Santa Ana wind condition, and then the wind shifts almost 180 degrees and comes out of the north towards the south. We did not have Santa Ana wind conditions during this episode. The maximum average wind speed was about 8.8 miles per hour, and the maximum 1-minute gust was about almost 32 miles per hour, and those were both observed on May 21st, which was the day that we had our highest daily concentration of lead. Next slide, please. And here you can see the daily lead concentrations, and in blue, and then the 1-minute gusts in yellow, and the red line is the notification limit. And you can see the one time that we exceeded the notification limit, where we had nearly 0.5 micrograms per meter cubed. That was the day of the highest wind gusts. So that was some correlation there, although it's not always it's not a consistent correlation. On the other days we had elevated hits. The wind was very variable, but the one strong correlation is that the day that we had what I would call an extraordinarily windy day in May was also coincident with the highest daily lead concentration. Next slide, please. And then we looked at drone data. Some of the cool pictures we're looking at come from the drone. We have a licensed drone operator on the site, and he flies the site every day. One of the things that we noted in May, and we thought might be a contributing factor, is that trucks would park near our station. So you see on the picture on the left-hand side, you see trucks. You see a semi-truck, and in front of it is a pickup truck with tires on it, and that's a repair truck. They would come out to do repairs to the tires of these trucks, and that activity would occur. And in at least one of the drone flights, we saw that while they were doing that, they would blow dust up into the air, coming out of the wheel wells of these semi-trucks, and that could very well be a source of dust. The city of Vernon was fantastic. We told them about the problem, and they, within days, came out and red curbed that corner on 26th Street and Indiana Street, and gave a pretty wide berth to the Northeast station. So at the very least, we got some relief from the truck traffic and truck, maintenance activities happening around that corner. Next slide, please. So what do we conclude? On the site, the permit standard of 0.1 microgram per meter cubed was never exceeded at the Northeast station, and none of the other 4 on-site stations indicated elevated concentrations of lead. However, AQMD's off-site re-rig monitor did exceed the 0.1 standard for a few days in May, and that is a permit condition. Those monitors, although we don't control them and we don't get the data, every day, they are still a permit compliance point. And so for a few days in May, we were just above the 0.1 standard. EPA's health-based national ambient air quality standard of 0.15 micrograms per meter cube was not exceeded in either the on-site or AQMD monitoring stations. The work stoppages, and there were 3, those were implemented by BERT, by me, proactively and voluntarily. We were in constant communication with our agency partners, but we very quickly, once we realized that we had an issue here that we couldn't get our hands around, we stopped and thought about the best way we can control the dust, and then implemented measures until we got it right, and are able now to continue the work and have good results. These measures included in the enhanced dust mitigation that we talked about. So the misting, the water cannons, the wind screens, 24-hour analyses, which expedited the data being delivered to us, and then we prohibited the truck parking and repair near the Northeast Monitor. These steps, we have resulted in reduced lead concentrations. We're back down to normal. And then a single source of dust wasn't identified, but I think the data point that it was the actual scaffold dismantlement activity as being the probable cause, with high wind events also having an adverse effect, and then an unquantifiable potential effect from the truck maintenance activities. These mitigation measures that we've talked about will stay place in the future when we're doing outside scaffolding activities. So they're in place right now while we are finishing the scaffolding around segment 3, and then they will also be used when we dismantle the segment 3 scaffolding in the future. Next slide, please. And here's some pictures of the enhanced dust suppression. The bottom picture, hopefully you can see the mist that we provided around the perimeter of the work zone. Again, this was in an effort to knock down dust particles before they got beyond the site fences. And then you can see the windscreen. So we put this to block wind and dust movements as the crews were dismantling the scaffolding. And it's probably very difficult to see, but there's also a water cannon right on top of the windscreen that is using to create a mist to, again, help control dust. Next slide, please. And then segment 3, it's upcoming. We actually have begun. We are in the midst of removing the stacks that rise above the roof line of the baghouse building. In the top right-hand picture, you can see the segment of one of the stacks being lifted up by the cranes. Before we did this, we applied a lead encapsulant coating to the stacks, both outside and inside. You can see that on the picture, the top picture on the left-hand side. You can see the man basket, and the guy in the man basket is applying that lead encapsulant coating to that stack. And once we're done with that, which we think will be in about another 10 to 15 days, we'll resume the dismantlement, the decontamination and dismantlement of the units within the building, and then move towards the decontamination and deconstruction of the baghouse building underneath its own FEU, and then finish that work up with an encapsulation of the floor. We are hopeful that we will be able to complete this segment 3 baghouse decontamination and deconstruction by the end of this year. That's the end of my presentation. I'd like to turn it over to Rene Bermudez of the South Coast AQMD.
Roberto, and yes, South Coast AQMD, Rene is our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto, for that introduction. And good evening, everyone. I'm Rene Bermudez, the Atmospheric Measurements Manager here at South Coast AQMD. my staff performed the daily operation of the South Coast AQMD monitors at Exide. So tonight I'm going to provide an overview of the South Coast lead monitors at Exide. So South Coast has been monitoring at the Exide facilities for 30 years now. And during that time, South Coast monitors have run concurrently with the Exide monitors according to an EPA schedule. So we operate 3 sites surrounding the facility. So the first site that we measure, Roberto presented, was an ATSF site, which was established in 1991, and that monitors every 3rd day for a 24-hour period of time. So the site is located in the train yard. The second site is our re-rig site, which was established in 2007 and is located across the street from Exide, also as Roberto had mentioned, and that site monitors every day for a 24-hour period of time. So the third site that we operate is the mid site, which was established in 2012, and it's co-located with the VERT sampler, and that's for quality control purposes. And I think Roberto also mentioned this in his presentation. And so these monitors were put in place to verify the Exide measurements that we're both reading the same type of concentrations. And since the inception of those sites, we found that the AQMD monitors have had good correlation with the VERT contract monitors, and they've both been reading similar concentrations. So overall, lead values have been on a downward trend since about 2008. So there have been no exceedances of the federal standard, as was mentioned in several presentations already, and since 2012. So the federal and health welfare standard is 0.15 micrograms. And so that's a 3-month rolling average. So that means it's the average lead concentration over a 3-month period of time. So we did measure elevated lead samples at several sites during April and May, and the maximum 24-hour concentration that we measured was 0.447 micrograms, and that was a 24-hour sample measured on May 13, 2021 at the re-rig site. So that was a little bit higher than the concentrations measured by the VERT samplers. So as Grant and Amanda had mentioned in their remarks, the 30-day threshold was exceeded during May, and that was 4 times. However, since that time, the concentrations have returned to their previously lower concentrations, and there have been no elevated samples since May 21st. So if you want to look at any of this data, all of this data is posted on the AQMD website, and it's available to look at and download. So during the last meeting, we mentioned that South Coast AQMD would be reducing the sampling frequency at the re-rig, ATSF, and mid sites beginning July 1st, 2021. However, since the elevated samples, we've decided to delay that sample reduction schedule until deconstruction of the stacks is completed at Exide. So meanwhile, as we move forward, when samples are analyzed, if we measure elevated samples with the AQMD monitors, the AQMD inspectors are immediately notified and respond to investigate. At that point, the site evaluation will take place, and an investigation of the elevated samples is ongoing during April and May, and compliance staff are on hand today to talk about that. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Victor Yip, ADEO Officer for Compliance and Enforcement.
Thank you, Renee. Good evening, everyone. My name is Victor Yip, Assistant Deputy Executive Officer for Compliance and Enforcement here at South Coast QMD. For my update, I'll be talking about some of our efforts in response to the elevated readings found at the Northeast Monitor and the offsite re-rig monitor. But currently, our department has an active open investigation into the matter, and we're still in the process of evaluating activities that occurred both on-site and off-site that could have contributed to the elevated readings. But generally, VERT has maintained good communication with our department. Whenever they saw elevated lead concentrations in the Northeast Monitor, they notified our staff, and upon receiving those notifications, we immediately deployed an inspector to the site to investigate. In fact, we've had inspectors at the site multiple times since the May 17th notification. And each time when VERT notified that they had proactively suspended activities, our inspectors confirmed that they implemented additional controls, such as applying extra water on the paved areas, extra sweeping, HEPA vacuuming, pressure washing, and installing those windscreens. But as part of our investigation, we did issue a notice to comply to VERT and the two contractors on June 8th to provide operating records, including inspection and repair records. Those records have since been provided to us and are currently in the process of being reviewed by our staff. We're also evaluating potential offsite activities that could have contributed to the elevated readings. Roberto mentioned there was some truck repair activities occurring near the Northeast Monitor. We're also looking at the City of Vernon street sweeping schedule and some of those street sweeping activities, and also some wind data to see if there's a causation to the elevated readings. Our inspectors were last on site on July 19th to observe the initial resumption of work, and we plan to stay on top of the activities and continue to have our inspectors on site to observe their operations. But with that, that concludes my update.
Thank you so much for your updates. Next, we'll go to the Q&A. So please, if you have questions, please submit your questions by raising your hand, or if there's something that you would like to have read by the facilitator, please submit that through Q&A. And I am looking to see if there are any attendees who would like to ask a question. This is your opportunity. I see a question right here, and I'm going to ask that if Mr. Yanez would please unmute himself and ask his question.
Hi there, good afternoon. Thanks for the presentation. Just real quick. Again, I ask if, so what are AQMD's plans for their offsite monitors at the moment? I understand that they've been actively monitoring this site for the past 30 years, but it's my understanding that they're in the process of doing away with their monitors or cease their monitoring operations. Can you guys clarify that as well?
This is Rene Bermudez. I can answer that question. So right now, we did bring up previously that we were going to reduce the sampling schedule at our re-rig monitoring site and also discontinue monitoring at our ATSF and mid sites. However, we would leave those monitors at that location in what we call standby mode. So if we needed to begin monitoring again, we could do that. Right now, we exceed all of the minimum monitoring requirements that the EPA has for our monitoring network. And so the primary samplers for the location are the VERT samplers, which there's 5 of those samplers, and our samplers are redundant at this point. The monitor ATSF, for example, is in the train yard, which is much farther away than the fence line samplers, and we haven't received high concentrations at any of those sites. The only site that has received a high concentration is the re-rig site, and that site's going to remain in operation.
And again,
let me add that any reduction in the sampling schedule is also going to be done in consultation with the EPA.
Thank you. I will ask another question from our Zoom audio, and then I will proceed to the Q&A to ask a question that's been posted there. Our next question is from last 3 digits are 831. If you could please unmute yourself to ask your question. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. You can hear me, right?
Yes, hello? We can. Thank you. We can hear you.
Okay. Okay, good. You have a cleanup plan in place, but it's a terminally flawed plan. It'll never totally clean up your mess completely. Your plan is fundamentally and inefficiently wrong. You must clean up the parkways and the attics, and you will never, ever return our properties to the point where they were before you guys messed up. Your plan will never stop the devastating health issues caused by the DTSC and Exide. Your plan cannot possibly reverse the ADD, ADHD, autism, learning deficiencies, behavioral problems, other medical health issues, cancers, and the exacerbation of diseases of the residents. Each day you continue with your failed plan pretty much guarantees more pregnant women, children, senior citizens, and others will be sickened and up to death. And this is due to your inefficient and incompetent plan. I want to answer this question. Knowing that your plan is financially, fundamentally inadequate, when is the DTSC going to ask for help to develop a more efficient plan to stop this continued negligence? You know, it's hard for you folks it's hard to listen to you guys sometimes because you say you've cleaned like 3,000 homes, but you know that not one single home has been completely cleaned. You know, you're not being honest to us. I mean, you've been to this one block here where I live at. There's only 19 homes. You've been back and forth to this block 7 different times. You could have cleaned 2 complete blocks with the amount of money it took you to clean those 7 homes. You have a failed plan. You need to ask for help. To try to convince people that you have cleaned up one single home completely is irresponsible, deliberate negligence. People are dying at the hands of the agency. Please ask for help and get a better plan in place. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I will go to the Q&A, and I have a question that is, how was the public notified of the work stop order? So if I could have one of our panelists answer that question.
I'll take that.
Thank you.
So this is Amanda with US EPA. We did post on our website, which is in the link in the chat, and then it's also in the link in the presentation for future reference if you're looking for it. Hopefully you should find it on Google also. But we did post in late May once we had the shutdown and we started the communications, and then we did our Tuesday postings. So that is the way that we did those. And then I also believe that Jason with AQMD had some. Jason, you want to go on that? Elaborate?
Yes, Jason Aspel, I'm Deputy Executive Officer over Engineering and Permitting at South Coast AQMD. Upon learning of our elevated readings, we did reach out to elected officials' offices and provided briefing for them. And in addition, we also had 2 AB 617 Community Steering Committee meetings after or as these episodes were going on. I provided briefings to both the East LA Boyle Heights West Commerce CSC meeting, as well as the Southeast LA meetings to inform the communities of the activities and monitoring readings, as well as we also updated our websites. So multiple outreach mechanisms during this time.
Thank you for that response. Our next question is, doesn't red curbing the street near the monitor just mask a problem of lead dust on the street? If someone could please answer that question.
This is Roberto Puga. Yeah, actually, it's a really good question. You know, the purpose of the red curbing wasn't really to address dust that may be ingrained in the pavement or of the sidewalk of the street. It was solely to prevent and prohibit trucks being serviced right next to the monitor, and releasing dust, from the wheel wells or the engine bays of these trucks. So it was removing a mobile outside source from impacting the monitors. In terms of the street and sidewalks, we did actually go out there to the street and wash and HEPA vacuum the street, as part of our mitigation measures. And one of the things we're looking at for long term is to see if we should implement a more regular cleaning schedule of the sidewalks and streets. And one of the data points we're going to be looking at is the information that AQMD is gathering regarding street sweeping by the city of Vernon and other potential offsite sources. Yeah, but just the red curbing was just to prevent trucks from parking there and having mechanics work on them.
Thank you, Roberto. And I would like the opportunity to go to our Spanish language line. Are there any questions from our Spanish language line? I hear no questions from our Spanish language line. I will go back to our Zoom line to see if there is anyone who has any questions. I do see a hand raised from Maravela Muro. Would you please unmute yourself and ask your question? Thank you.
Yes, I'm wondering about I know you mentioned about informing people of the process that you're doing throughout the different regions. I'm working, my family also is part of the Wyvern Wood housing complex, and there have been some excavations being conducted, but no one on the premises has been informed of the contamination of the property. They've just received a survey about landscaping and how the pathways are being used. And there is a tent with people from I guess is FE consultant group, but again, no one has been informed of the Exide and the lead contamination, its consequences, nor have they been provided with an option of going to get tested. Is that being done, and why hasn't it been done? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Ms. Muro. Today we're answering questions regarding the Exide exceedance. We will respond to that question. We will contact you at the end of this meeting. And thank you so much for participating, and we will have an answer for you. Our next we do have a question here from a participant who says, why didn't DIVERT or DTSC say anything they did to notify the public about the shutdown? So if there's someone who would like to answer that question.
Johanna.
Thank you.
So the way that the budget has been approved for the trust is that EPA is doing the public communications for the trust work, and this is being done as a cost-saving measure. As many of our other presentations have focused on, this is a trust that is not fully funded to complete all of the work. So EPA is using our resources for the website and the public communication. And every week, multiple times a week, there are ongoing calls with DTSC and AQMD. And so all of the coordination that was being done for public dissemination was done with both DTSC and AQMD's knowledge. And I think I don't know that I want to speak for DTSC, but since they knew we were doing all the releases, they knew that ahead of time. And their public affairs and their PR type groups, I think, knew that they didn't want to duplicate the effort since it was already done. And they put out public releases for us in the form of the e-blast and said the links into our documents.
Joanna, could I add something as far as
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you.
I just also want to make the community aware in this forum as well. As part of our AB 617 process, we do community monitoring as well as beyond Exide. A lot of that is on our AB 617 website at aqmd.gov. If you just search for AB 617. But we do have a monitor at Resurrection Church, which did not show elevated lead readings through all of this, but also as part of our efforts, we've also done mobile monitoring, which is a little more involved and involves driving monitors throughout the streets. That wasn't done concurrently. I just want to make everyone aware that that data is publicly available. Thank you, Jonah.
Thank you. And our final question that we have on the Q&A is.
And Joanna,
Yes.
may I address the last question too for just a second? Yeah, it's Roberto Puga, and as Mrs. Cruz rightly pointed out, the EPA has taken the burden for public communication, but the VERT, does provide exhibits, pictures, video, the data in forms that are easily translated to be put up on websites. We also prepared a fairly comprehensive summary of the work stoppage and resumption and the reasons for it. That is up on EPA's website, and and we very willingly participate in public forums like this one, and for example, we briefed Supervisor Solis's staff on this issue a few weeks ago also. So although I don't have a formal role in public communication, I do work with our agency partners to provide them with the information and data that they need to effectively communicate with the community.
Thank you, Roberto. We have one more question here before I go back to the Zoom. Do we know what effects the release will have on the surrounding community's health? Are there particular houses or neighborhoods who are more likely to be affected by the release?
Joanna, if I may very quickly, this is Mehdi. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's important to highlight that DTSC has been sending those e-blasts to let people know. In addition, we hold actually several meetings with government agencies and elected officials, and we have made sure that they were informed so they can spread the word. That's just in addition to what EPA and VERT has stated here as far as the notification. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehdi. And I would like to go back to the Zoom line, and I do see that Nicole Mutox has raised her hand. If you could please unmute yourself. I see the hand has been lowered. I will go ahead and go back to our Q&A. We do have a question. If elevated levels of lead were recently detected, were these characterized as a hazardous release? If so, was a report made to the Office of Emergency Services? If one of our panelists would like to take that question.
I think I maybe have a question about the question. I'm not sure if what's being asked is a reportable quantity of lead was being released, because that's the type of like EPGRA and CERCLA type reporting I'm familiar with. I don't know the regulatory significance of the term hazardous release other than a reportable quantity. So maybe if they want to, Yvonne, if you'd like to type in a little bit more information, then perhaps I could elaborate.
Yes, if the individual who typed the question would like to elaborate, we can ask the question again. But we will move on to the next question. It says, do we know what effect the release will have on the surrounding, wait, I think we just asked this. This was the question. Do we know what effect the release will have on the surrounding community's health? Are these particular houses, neighborhoods who are more likely to be affected by the release?
I can answer part of that. In terms of AQMD's data, we previously mentioned, we have our 3 monitors around the area, and to the north is our ATSF monitor at the rail yard. That was not impacted during this episode. It did seem to be confined to the Indiana and 26 area, and the other monitors didn't show elevated readings, as well as the Resurrection Church in the community didn't show any elevated readings. So this did seem to be confined to the immediate area.
Thank you for that.
Also, I just also wanted to add that the EPA's health-based standards were not at all approached or exceeded. And so especially with the 90-day rolling average. So I know there were some questions about the community health. And so the health-based standards were not exceeded for the EPA's levels.
Thank you, Jason and Amanda, for that response. I will go one last time to the Spanish language line. If there is anybody on the Spanish language line who has a question, this would be the opportunity to ask that question. Thank you. We're going to do a last round of questions. If there's anybody on Zoom who has a question or on the Q&A. I have one last question here. And we do have, a question here. If I understand the answer about red curving correctly, it had nothing to do with lead, unless it is the thought that the wheel wells had lead from elsewhere. If one of the panelists would like to answer that question.
Yeah, yes. Actually, the questioner, I think hit upon it correctly. Yeah, the red curbing was to prohibit trucks from being serviced. And the concern is that as the trucks were being serviced, they would use air pressure to clean around the wheel wells and put dust airborne that had the potential to contain dust. So that's why we did that.
Thank you, Roberto. And we have 2 other questions here. Referring to the previous question regarding about the releases, the person states the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Cal OES, has this release reporting. And I do believe, Amanda, you answered that question.
Sure. So the reportable quantity for lead is actually 10 pounds. So to have a release of 10 pounds of lead is the time in which you would be making the hazard on the federal level. So the term release, I think, is, I hear what you're saying about you're hearing the term release. And so it really isn't necessarily a release as much as the ambient air showed some lead particles that were entrained in the dust that was being, quote, released from the site. And the reason that term is being thrown around is that the trust does undergo extensive amount of effort to contain of all the lead on the site. They have air curtains, they have water curtains. They actually have a big crane that holds a sheet in the air to prevent any dust. So because AQMD has a monitor at an off-site location, off the perimeter, that was what is considered a release. But really it is just an airborne concentration that was detected that left the perimeter. And so that's why the term release is being used. I hope that clarifies with this. But again, this was not a reportable quantity that would be triggering any type of list of lists CERCLA type actions. and that would require a emergency response. And I see a follow-up question is, what's the concentration for California? So Grant, Mehdi, do you guys want to take, I'm not sure if California has created their own reportable quantity limit, but it is 10 pounds. And so just to kind of, I don't know, Jason, if you could do the math in your head of what the microgram concentration is of like that one air.
I'll put it in context. Obviously, any amount of lead is concerning, and we investigate in relation to our standards, the airborne standards. You're talking in the order of pounds. There's over 400 grams in a pound. Our fence line, AQMD's fence line standards are 0.100 micrograms. So, you're talking fractions of a gram, and so even more of those in a pound, and that's per cubic meter of air. So I'll try and simplify this is we have a filter out there, air is drawn through it throughout the day, and it collects lead. Over that 24 period, if it's over that 0.1 micrograms, over 30 days, 30 different days go over that, and that's over our fence line standard. So it's not a direct comparison to that 10-pound release limit. That's something else that's not our air standard, but hopefully that kind of clarifies the two.
Thank you for that response, Jason. Our final question for the night is, would there be a similar potential releases in segment 3 or additional deconstruction facility?
Thank you, Mr. Santana, for that question. The work that's going to be done to decontaminate and deconstruct segment 3, will be done under a completed, fully enclosed unit, a HACI, like segment 2 and segment T and segment 1 were done. Our experience, the historical experience of the site is that the HACIs are very, very efficient at preventing lead dust concentrations to go above the permit level. And we fully expect that the HACI over segment 3 will be just as efficient. Where we need to be careful and where, what we just learned, lessons learned, is that once the building is gone and you are dismantling the HACI, you have a potential, for dust. And we've learned, one, that potential exists, and we've learned what enhanced mitigation measures can combat that problem. And we will be using those enhanced mitigation measures when the time comes to dismantle the scaffolding for the segment 3 HACI.
Thank you, Roberto. And we have gone a bit over our time, but I would, before we move to our closing comments by our Deputy Director, Grant Cope, I would like to make a brief announcement. Our next community meeting is on September 9th. We will be sending out postcards and e-blasts. So again, that is September 9th is our next community meeting. And right now I would like to invite our Deputy Director, Grant Cope, back for a closing comment.
Great. Thank you very much, Johanna. I just want to once again thank everybody for spending time with all of us this evening. We hope that the information, the additional information and details that we've provided have been helpful in understanding both the circumstances that we encountered in the spring and the actions that were taken thereafter. And the concept too of lessons learned. In many respects, the dismantling of this building is, you can plan as much as you want, and every day you work as hard as you can to implement all the actions that we have to as safely as possible. When things like this pop up, it's important that we be protective first, and that we identify what went wrong and that we correct it. That's why we're here. So if something was unclear, let us know. We will get back to you. But right now, just thank you very much, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you so much, Grant. Please, everyone, have a safe and wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your input and your questions.